Culture is one of those words. We know what it means, but it can be really hard to explicitly define. It can be thought of as customs and behaviors of a particular group of people. However, those sort of outward manifestations are often just deeper reflections of inward beliefs and values. Some describe culture by using a metaphor, like computer software of the mind, the mental programming that distinguishes one group of people from another and leads to different outputs. I'll be sharing why it's important for us to study and understand differences in culture. In their landmark work, Hofstede et al. Created a six-dimensional model of national cultures. They used data from research surveys all over the world and found significant differences in the way that people from each country tended to answer. Today, I'm going to focus on one dimension, power distance. Power distance scores give us information about the degree of inequality that's expected and acceptable. The higher the number is, the higher these people have a toleration for inequality. In the survey, respondents indicated not only the way that they perceive their situation to be, but also their preference for the way they would like it to be. In many cases, the values were correlated. People tended to like things the way that they actually were. Nations with higher scores expect their environment to have inequalities. In a work situation, they prefer one that reflects a dependence on a boss who makes decisions autocratically or paternalistically. Nations with a lower score expressed a preference for a boss who consulted with subordinates before making a decision. In this graph, you can see how three nations scored on the Power Distance Index. China was high at 80, Austria low at 11, and the United States on the lower end of the middle at 40. These rankings are not meant to be definitive measures, rather they're guidelines to help us understand general tendencies. Although the US may be lower in the Power Distance Index, there are variations within the country and subcultures that can skew higher than the nation as a whole. So what implications does this have for the church in the United States? First, it's important for us to understand that our culture will help us determine what we think is right and best. As much as churches would like to believe that our practices stem from biblical values, we also need to look at how our cultural values may be unintentionally influencing our decision-making. And by culture, I don't necessarily mean non-Christian American culture. Every church has its own culture, and that it can stem from church history, leadership, denomination, theology, or the region that it's located in. A church should analyze its own culture so that it understands where it falls on this scale and others compared to the culture around them. When a church can understand its own culture, it can compare itself to the more general American culture, as well as cultural practices of churches around the world. This can make it easier to see when that church's culture reflects more American values than Christian values. Self-analysis can also help churches determine the distance between their perceived culture and what's practiced in reality. It's possible that a church may view themselves as very democratic in their culture, but in their practices, it might be revealed that often decisions are made in a more authoritarian manner. Hofstede remarks on the tendency for corporate culture to put out written statements of their values and ideology, but says that they're mostly just pious wishful thinking that corresponds to the top management's opinions, not the actual cultural climate. In reality, the values of an organization are not based on what people say, but what they actually do, and this is also true for churches. Hofstede says hypocrisy is worse than silence, and I agree. Without an understanding of cultural differences, there can be a lot of potential tension. And it's important to note here that neither a high nor low power distance is right or wrong. Because churches are organizations, each will determine their stance on the proper balance of power, whether by careful analysis or by default, as decisions happen and remain unchallenged. Organizing people necessitates answering the question, who has the power to make decisions here? And when people have different ideas about how decisions should be made and who should make them, there's a lot of space for cultural tension. Let's consider an example of two scenarios of people serving together on a church team. The first, where everyone has a high power distance, and the second, where everyone has a low power distance. In the first scenario, a leader has planned a meeting in order to execute their ideas. The attendees come into the meeting expecting they will be told what to do. They won't give input unless they're directly asked, and they won't contradict the leader. In the second scenario, a leader has planned the meeting to get input from the group and make a decision together. Attendees come into the meeting prepared, expecting to participate in a discussion of group goals and speak up without being asked. They won't hesitate to give alternative ideas or to play devil's advocate. You may already have an idea of which meeting you'd rather be involved in. What's interesting is that both scenarios could lead to an efficient and effective meeting if everyone has similar perspectives of why they're there. The tension comes when not everyone has the same values. Perhaps there's a leader with a low power distance, but the attendees are not. The leader may walk away frustrated because it took so much effort to hear the group's thoughts. They may feel like they had to drag it out of them. Conversely, a leader with a high power distance may walk away from a meeting with attendees with low power distance, feeling disrespected when attendees gave unsolicited advice. So we can see knowledge of the power dimension can be very applicable in ministry. In order to gain the most benefit, leaders within a church need to understand their own expectations about power differences may not align with the church culture. To make it more complicated, congregants, staff, and other lay leaders may also have different views of appropriate power differences. When faced with tensions, the first thing to do is to withhold judgment and get curious. Ask yourself, is this happening because there are different cultural values at play? Next, ask questions. If there's a mismatch in leadership values in our two scenarios, a leader might talk to an attendee after the meeting and say something like, I noticed you were quick to shoot down my plans, and I was wondering what prompted that. Or in the opposite situation, hey, I noticed you didn't say anything in our meeting today, and I was wondering why not. Next, clarify your expectations. Say something like, in the future, I'd appreciate it if you allow me to set the agenda so we can move quickly to other issues. Or, in future meetings, I'd really appreciate more feedback and active participate in the discussion because I value your input. Then extend grace. Understanding differences in the ideas of power can help us to more charitably judge the motives of others. And after all those things have been done, it's possible you may need to leave. Although I believe God is most glorified when believers of diverse cultures are able to work together in unity, I also know that culture is stubbornly resistant to change. A person with a lower power distance may find that being in a hierarchical ministry setting constrains their gifts and abilities, and they would be better suited to another ministry. A person with a high power distance may continually feel frustrated by the length of time that decisions tend to take, or the expectation that everyone needs to have a say. If the organizational culture of a church or ministry runs contrary to your own values, you'll need to pray about how and where you can best serve. You may need to decide if you're willing to assimilate to the current culture and how much that costs you personally. In conclusion, navigating the differences in cultural expectations can be challenging. It's no miracle when like-minded people get along, but when people with different cultural values work together in harmony, the world can witness a beautiful work of unity that only the Holy Spirit can accomplish. However, false unity is attained when cultural differences are ignored or suppressed instead of celebrating. When people in the minority must assimilate to the culture of a larger group, the world misses the opportunity to hear of God's people living in harmony, not just in unison. Ultimately, all power and authority stems from God, and He empowers His followers with authority. Yet we're also called to submit to power and authority in our lives. Although believers may disagree how these truths should be balanced, when we are able to understand our differences, we can serve together in humility, and the miracle of our unity will be a witness to God's power.